Hello everyone, back at it again with a new video. This is a video on McCarthy. McCarthy's second novel, Outer Dark, is quite slim, like his three early works before Blood Meridian or Sutry as well. I will just read you the blurb on Wikipedia for simplicity's sake. Outer Dark is the second novel by American writer Cormac McCarthy, published in 1968. The time and setting are nebulous, but can be assumed to be somewhere in Appalachia. Sometime around the turn of the 20th century, the novel tells of a woman named Rinthi who bears her brother's baby. The, the brother Kula leaves the nameless infant in the woods to die, but tells his sister that the newborn died of natural causes and has to be buried. Rinthi discovers this lie and sets out to find the baby for herself. So, there is a McCarthy podcast that's on quite a few episodes now. They did an exploration of Outer Dark with Neil Sullivan. If you want to check that out, it's the Cormac McCarthy podcast website. So, instead of critiquing the book, because there's no real critiques when discussing McCarthy, he was always on the top of his game, so to speak. This is more of an appreciation of prose than a real review. So if you're looking for a review, try making one of your own, or look on Goodreads, if you will. So the first quote I would like to read to you is from the first passage. They crested out on the bluff in the late afternoon sun with their shadows long on the sawgrass and burnt sedge, moving single file and slowly high above the river and with something of its own impeccability, pausing and grouping for a moment and going on again, strung out in silhouette against the sun and the dropping under the crest of the hill into a fold of blue shadow with light touching them about the head in spurious sanctity until they had gone on for such a time as saw the sun down altogether and they moved in shadow altogether, which suited them very well. That is all in one sentence. More on that later. When they reached the river, it was full dark, and they made camp, and a small fire across which their shapes moved in a nameless black ballad. They had cooked whatever it was they had with them in whatever crude vessels, and turned into sleep, sprawled on the packed mud full cloth with their mouths gaped to the stars. They were about with the first light, the bearded one rising and kicking out the other two, and still with no word among them, rekindling the fire and setting their battered pannikins about, squatting on their haunches, eating again wordlessly with belt knives until the bearded one rose and stood spread-legged before the fire and closed the other two in a foul white plume of smoke out of and through which they fought suddenly and unannounced and mute and as suddenly ceased, picking up the rag duffled and moving west along the river once again. So, as always in Southern Gothic tradition, it is quite dark, and like in The Devil All the Time, it is focused sometimes on the prose, mostly on the characters and setting. Setting plays a huge part in Southern Gothic literature. If you've seen The Devil All the Time with Tom Holland and Robert Pattinson, then you know that setting is a character like in Taxi Driver or Joker or Apocalypse Now. McCarthy intertwines long run-ons with short, simple sentences, which is borrowed heavily from Faulkner, who wrote Absalom, Absalom, Sanctuary, The Sound and the Fury, um, Light in August, and A Rose for Emily, which is taught in schools, along with The Sound and the Fury, which is taught in schools. The purpose of run-on sentences is not necessarily or primarily a focus on craftsmanship. It is meant to throw into the world in which the setting or the story takes place, which refers back to Heideggerian terms such as thrown into the world, where we are thrown into the world without preconceived notions, without any guidance, and must learn to live within the world itself. So in the first line on page 5, it says, "She shook him," end quote. This is meant to this is meant to create atmosphere and mystery to the story, and this happens quite often in the book as well. So here is another example of prose, another run on page 11. Dark came, and this time he did have a fire going out from time to time with the worn axe and splitting kindling, and later by the lantern light scouring the near woods for old stumps, which he split out and dressed of their rotted hearts, bringing in the hard and weathered shells and stacking them on the floor beside the earth. Sorry, I'm trying to find the next example of prose. Here it is, on page 131. He kept walking, again creating atmosphere and mystery to the novel. He kept walking after the sun was down. There were no more houses. Later a moon came up and the road before him went dwindling chalky and vaporous through the black woods. Swamp peepers hushed constantly before him and commenced behind as if he moved in a void claustral to sound. He carried a stick with him and prodded each small prone shadow through which he passed, but this road held only shapes of things. So this starts off with simple sentences and carries on throughout. It is interesting that when you are writing something, you don't want your sentence structure to all be the same. And that is what McCarthy keeps in mind when creating this book. Here is an example of theme on page 191 when one of the characters replies, "Hard people make hard times. I've seen the meanness of human till I don't know why God ain't put out the sun and gone away." So when we're suffering, we would like the suffering to end, obviously. However, there are many ways in which one can do this, healthily or unhealthily, beneficially and unbeneficially. So sometimes we blame God for, rightly so, for the miseries of the world because he could have just easily created a world without said suffering and decided not to. Or maybe it is more in the case of the Gnostics, which McCarthy explores in Blood Meridian, where there is a God, he is pure and perfect, but there is a demiurge who runs and operates the world unsuccessfully as if a pure and true God would. Here is another example of prose on 217, quote, "The gap was narrow, and when he got to it, he could see the hogs walled up in the clamorous and screeching flume that fanned again on the far side in the high meadows skirting the bluff of the river. They were wheeling faster and wider out along the sheer rim of the bluff in the arc of the dusty uproar, and he could hear the drovers below him calling, and he could see the dead gray serpentine of the river below that. Hogs were pouring through the gap and building against the ones in the meadow until these began to buckle at the edges. Holmes saw that one of them pitched, screaming in stifle-lagged pirouettes and 100 feet into the river. He moved down the slope toward the bluff and the road that they went along. The drovers were racing brokenly across the mounting hogs with staves aloft, stumbling and falling among them, making for the outer perimeter to head them from the cliff. This swept a new wave of panic among the hogs, like the wind through grass until a whole echelon of them carrying up the outer flank and forsook the land and fared into space with torn cries. Now the entire herd had begun to wheel wider and faster along the bluff, and the outermost ranks swung centrifugally over the escarpment, row and on row, wailing and squalling, and above this, the howls and curses of the drovers that now appeared in the moil of flesh they tended and swept with. Dust had begun to assume satanic looks with their staves and wild eyes, as if they were no true swineherds, but disciples of darkness got along those charges to herd them to their doom. This is another example of prose, and it's quite amazing how McCarthy can create sentences out of nothing. Here's another example of themes in 236, where it says, they say people in hell ain't got names, but they had to be called something to get sent there, didn't they? So, in existentialism, a thing exists and does not have any defining characteristics. You can always imagine different viewpoints of that thing, but there is always this perspective of something. And a tree isn't necessarily a tree until it was called a tree as well. So that's about it. I hope you aren't disappointed with the lack of discussion on the book. I just wanted to express how amazing McCarthy is, and the only way he can do that is through his prose. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a good day. Good night.